Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Thomas Homer-Dixon, who is the director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia. Between 2009 and 2014, he was the founding director of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation, and his books include The Upside of Down, Catastrophe, Creativity, and the Renewal of Civilization, The Ingenuity Gap, Can We Solve the Problems of the Future, and Environment, Scarcity and Violence. And his latest book is Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril. And he has an article at the Globe and Mail, The American Polity is Cracked and Might Collapse. Canada Must Prepare. Welcome to Background Briefing, Thomas Homer-Dixon.
It's good to be with you.
And the message that you've put out here has gotten a lot of attention here in the Colossus to the South. And that is this message that by 2025, American democracy could collapse, causing extreme domestic political instability, including widespread civil violence. By 2030, if not sooner, the country could be governed by a right-wing dictatorship. So you're joining others or others are joining you, like Stephen March and Barbara Walters, who I spoke with yesterday, as a new book, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. It seems to be in the zeitgeist. What prompted you to write this piece?
I've been thinking about this piece in particular for over 6 months. But like so many people, I've been very concerned about the political, social, and cultural developments in the United States for years, since before Donald Trump was elected as president. And I was writing extensively about the implications of his election before he was elected, actually. But this particular piece emerged from a sense that, especially in Canada, we had sort of come to the conclusion that all that disarray in the United States had gone away with the election of President Biden and his installation as president. And we didn't have to worry about the United States anymore. It was like this huge sigh of relief. And frankly, I think it was probably a sigh of relief around much of the world and democratic polities around the world. But when you tracked what was happening within the country, within the United States, the situation's actually deteriorating quite quickly. And I also, I read two things over the summer that helped crystallize my concerns. One was the remarkable biography of Hitler, the first volume of Volker Ulrich's biography of Hitler that charts his rise up to 1939. And I was particularly interested in the Weimar Republic, what happened during the Weimar period in the 1920s and early 30s in Germany, and also how quickly Hitler was able to consolidate power after he became chancellor in early 1933. And the second thing I read was a draft manuscript, which is soon to be published as a book by Oxford University Press by a young English scholar who's been a colleague of mine for many years, Jonathan Leader Maynard. And the title of it is Ideology and Mass Killing. And Jonathan is quickly establishing himself as probably one of the world's leading theorists on the implications of ideology for social instability and violence. And I started to understand better, even though I've studied these issues for many decades, how radical ideologies can essentially produce a kind of self-reinforcing dynamic within a society of extremism and increased radicalization. In a sense, the ideologies take on a life of their own. And as I was reading both of these documents, I could see so many echoes and so many resonances with what was happening in the United States. I felt really that message had to become more broadly disseminated, I guess you could say, within Canada at least. I never expected it was going to get such attention around the world.
And you also, in your article, point out that former President Trump, if he does come back in 2024, he will have only two objectives: vindication and vengeance. I mean, you're a political scientist, but in many ways, it's almost like we need to tap into psychiatry here, because this is a man who has such a fragile ego, but he's also a chronic narcissist, that he cannot accept defeat. And it's so clear from what happened when he got defeated, and then with the negotiations he had to try and overturn the election on January the 5th and thereabouts, and then on the 6th, basically turning a huge crowd towards the Capitol. Plan B, if you will. He first tried a coup. It didn't work. He couldn't get Pence to go along with his coup. Then he turned the mob on the Capitol. And then that Plan B, and Plan C arguably was that he would have declared martial law and a state of emergency. So the thing that I find extraordinary is that the divisions in this country, which pre-existed but Trump has exacerbated enormously, are now being even widened by this essentially sick man who cannot personally accept defeat. And he has managed to basically project this neurosis of his onto the GOP, and it's metastasized into a political movement known as Stop the Steal, based on a lie, a complete fiction. It's just extraordinary, don't you think?
Well, it is extraordinary and terrifying, to be frank. And one of the things I note in my article in the Globe and Mail is the quite striking parallels with developments in the Weimar Republic in the 20s and 30s. And I note 5 parallels in particular, including the fact that in both cases, an extraordinarily charismatic leader was able to mobilize his extremist followers to try to seize the state, or attempt to seize the state in Trump's case, but actually succeed in Hitler's case. And we can get into a discussion of the pathologies of Donald Trump. I think it's worth actually talking about those things, whether he's clinically mentally ill or not. But the key thing is that he has this extraordinary charismatic hold on tens of millions of followers. And in that sense, he's truly brilliant. He has a capacity to communicate with them that is unparalleled. Another thing I noted in my comments about Weimar is, and you just highlighted it, is that in both cases, there was this falsehood that became a kind of catalyst for mobilization and radicalization. In the case of Weimar for the Nazis, it was the stab in the back, the idea that there were internal enemies, Jews in particular, who had allowed Germany to be defeated in the First World War and had undermined it from within. And of course, now we have this falsehood, the big lie about the 2020 election being stolen, which is truly poisonous for democracy. If people can't trust the institutions, the electoral machinery in a democracy, then everything starts to fall apart. So, and as I also point out, it kind of establishes a line between those who are worthy of moral consideration as real Americans and those who are outside that boundary. From the point of view of a lot of Trump supporters, if they accept the big lie, then there are tens of millions of people in the country who have essentially stolen power from their leader. And they are no longer worthy of membership in the moral community of America. And as I point out in my article, that's only one psychological step away from the kind of dynamics of dehumanization that have led to some of the worst violence in human history. So these parallels are very, I think it's right to describe them as more than scary. They're terrifying. And one thing that I'm trying to communicate to people as something of an expert in these areas is that it's not clear where this process stops. I mean, people think, well, okay, Trump becomes president again. I mean, he may create a regime that's similar to Viktor Orban's regime in Hungary, or maybe we'll end up with something ultimately like a kind of Putin-esque hard nationalist autocracy. But there's also an either of which would be terrible for the United States and terrible for the world, of course. But there's also a scenario in which you see much broader, deeper violence, much of it organized by the state against populations internally that are regarded as enemies. And this is where Jonathan Leader Maynard's arguments come in, because he talks about, and this is another parallel with Weimar, the propagation of what he calls hardline security doctrines that basically, ideologies that basically say there are internal enemies and they need to be eliminated. We're hearing that language more and more often from the extreme right in the United States, and it's being picked up even by people who are closer to power. And it's echoed by Donald Trump himself. And that's very scary.
And again, I'm speaking with Thomas Homer-Dixon, who is the director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia, and between 2009 and 2014 was the founding director of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation, and his books include The Upside of Down, Catastrophe, Creativity, and the Renewal of Civilization, The Ingenuity Gap, Can We Solve the Problems of the Future, and Environment, Scarcity, and Violence. And his latest book is Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew the World, A World in Peril. And he has an article at the Globe and Mail, The American Polity is Cracked and Might Collapse. Canada Must Prepare. So the analogy, though, with Weimar and between Trump and Hitler, of course, Trump is no Hitler. Trump was just spectacularly incompetent, whereas Hitler, at least
Yes.
In the beginning, was pretty competent. He captured most of the world and then went mad. But how does that explain the cult-like adherence to him when you've got people like, as you mentioned in your article, Tucker Carlson and Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene? They've transformed the Republican Party into a near-fascist personality cult that's a perfect instrument for wrecking democracy. Why do they worship this man? What do they see in him that is obviously not there?
Well, I think you've touched on a number of really important points. I mean, there was a striking difference between Donald Trump. I mean, there are many differences, and one always has to be very careful when you start talking about Weimar Germany and the rise of the Nazis and Hitler. Donald Trump is not Hitler. One of the things that I recognized as I was reading Ulrich's biography is that Hitler was strategically, politically incredibly smart, and he was smart tactically too, and he learned very fast from his errors. And he was often one or two steps ahead of everybody else around him as he maneuvered the Nazi Party within the Weimar democracy to increase its vote. So I think in some respects, democracy was saved in the United States by Donald Trump's incompetence, at least with respect to things like the pandemic. If he'd been more successful in handling the COVID pandemic, I think he would have been reelected. I mean, it's even possible that if the vaccines had been announced 2 weeks earlier, 3 weeks earlier, he would have won the election. It was a very close call. But what kind of hold does he have on people? I think one of the greatest strengths you can have as a politician, conventional or otherwise, is to be underestimated. And I think people have made the mistake of underestimating Donald Trump. He is brilliant in his intuitive understanding of the emotional cadences of his followers, of their needs, and how to appeal to them, both with positive emotions of devotion and loyalty and sense of duty, and negative emotions of fear and anger and disgust. And he's like a master conductor of an orchestra. And so he has that capacity to communicate with tens of millions of people who have been, as I point out in my article, significantly excluded from the trajectory of economic development and the benefits of economic development in the United States over the last several decades. So median male wages haven't increased, didn't increase between 1979 and 2019 when you take account of inflation, which is extraordinary when you think about it. And meanwhile, CEO incomes have skyrocketed. The average CEO's income is now close to 300 times that of an employee within his or her company, whereas in the 1970s, it was around 30 times. So these widening income gaps, the concentration of wealth and opportunity in large metropolitan areas, especially in coastal zones, while much of the rest of the country falls behind, and people suffer from chronic insecurity and fear about losing their health care, collapse of manufacturing industries as they've moved overseas or down to Mexico. And so when Donald Trump spoke in his inauguration in early 2017 about, how did he call it, the wreckage of America or something like that, a lot of liberals scoffed and said, what is he talking about? But when you go to these parts of the country and you see how they've stagnated and in many cases have been left behind by the rest of the country, you start to get a sense for the anger. So Donald Trump, you want to know what his hold is? He's their wrecking ball. He's the guy who will go in and teach those elites a lesson smash things up, wreck the system, because the system, as far as many of these people are concerned, isn't working for them. It's corrupt. And then of course he just further accelerates the process by feeding in various kinds of falsehoods and lies about conspiracies and about stolen elections and the like. So don't underestimate Donald Trump when it comes to his capacity to understand and manipulate the emotions of his followers. But my concern is that he is just the next stage of potentially a two-stage process. He will win re-election. He will manage to essentially remove from the bureaucratic state apparatuses, especially in Washington, D.C., the technocrats and others who are holding things together and abiding by the rule of law. And then he basically sets up the situation for a more managerially competent right-wing autocrat following on from him. So the charisma he has could do all the damage necessary to produce this kind of slide into dictatorship that I talk about in my article.
Well, the other possibility, though, is that he could actually, there's massive voter suppression going on, which the GOP is completely brazen about, and they'd rather cheat than compete. It's pretty obvious. But Trump could actually win in 2024, and the Republicans could win in 2022.
Yes.
But Trump could win simply because the Democrats are sort of floundering. They've so mishandled Manchin, who was from the beginning said what he was about and what he would accept, and yet they've dragged out these negotiations forever. And Biden, of course, in many ways was elected because he was a long-time insider serving in the Senate for a number of decades. And the expectation was that he would, he could reach across the aisle and get things done. And that's clearly not happening. So the American people, ideology aside, they want somebody that can deliver. And the perception, even though the Democrats have delivered on a lot of things, the perception is that, we look at the poll numbers for Biden.
Yes, I think he suffered terribly from specifics like the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also the continuation of the pandemic and the resurgence of the pandemic. He's the guy on deck, so he gets blamed. But I think you're quite right. It's entirely conceivable that not only will Republicans take both houses of Congress in the 2022 elections relatively legitimately, if you sort of ignore the fact that a lot of the rules have been bent in the process through gerrymandering and the like. And then they could quite possibly, given anger and dyspeptic attitudes within the American population in 2023 and 2024, could reelect Donald Trump, in a sense, legitimately, by playing more or less according to the rules in 2024. But there's also the possibility that it will be a very close thing, and that the difference between a Democratic and a Republican presidency will come down to outright vote suppression and manipulation and control of electoral machinery in specific tipping point states. And in that case, I think we're looking at a situation where you could have a profoundly divided population and real possibilities for violence between the two sides. One thing I keep coming back to in my article, I mentioned it several times, is just the extraordinary level of weapons availability within the United States. There's no other country in the world, I believe. I don't even think Switzerland, with its state-managed availability of weapons for civil defense, there's no other country in the world that has the kind of easy availability of light weapons that the United States does. Now, most of them are there's a disproportionate control of those weapons and ownership of those weapons on the right of the political spectrum. So if the Democrats squeaked out a victory in 2024, Trump or whoever's the Democratic presidential candidate, let's say it's Trump, would almost certainly declare that was illegitimate, that it was manipulated. And I don't see a scenario in which that produces a happy outcome. I see a very high probability of significant violence in that kind of situation.
And we're continuing the conversation with Thomas Homer-Dixon, who's the director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia. And between 2009 and 2014, he was the founding director of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation, and his books include The Upside of Down, Catastrophe, Creativity, and the Renewal of Civilization, The Ingenuity Gap, Can We Solve the Problems of the Future, and Environment, Scarcity and Violence. And his latest book is Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril. And he has an article at the Globe and Mail, The American Polity is Cracked and Might Collapse, Canada Must Prepare. So in terms of, the kindling is there for a civil war, there's no question. And you mentioned, in fact, I spoke the other day with Robert Pape at the University of Chicago, who's doing research particularly into the numbers of people in this country who believe that the election was stolen and that violence will be necessary to restore Trump to his rightful place. And then you put into the mix the 400 million firearms in the hands of ordinary citizens. That's incredibly lethal. But the possibility then that you're suggesting would be, I imagine, that if the voter suppression is such and the stealing of the election and the rigging is such, particularly with the Republican legislatures in various states simply changing the votes because they don't like the outcome, you could have a lot of angry Democrats, many minorities who tried to vote and couldn't vote because of voter suppression, and then those that did vote, to see their votes so brazenly stolen, they may take to the streets. And of course, in many ways, if you look at what happened with Black Lives Matter and the response from the militias, it's left-wing activism, not left-wing violence, but left-wing activism becomes an excuse for right-wing violence, does it not?
Well, there's another element to that scenario. What happens if, for instance, the evidence is pretty clear that these Republican legislatures are operating beyond the boundaries of the law, and President Biden simply refuses to accept the election result, or it simply refuses to accept the slates of electors or the process of voting through the Electoral College that's been corrupted by those state legislatures as they put forward their own slates of electors. So he isn't prepared to transfer power under those circumstances. I think that we're in highly speculative scenarios at this point. Now, to be fair, a lot of people who know the details of the potential dynamics much better than I are starting to think about these scenarios in detail. There's been a fixation on the possibility of quote unquote civil war, some type of civil war quite distinct from, of course, America's Great Civil War, more like chronic insurgent violence occurring in various parts of the country between highly mobilized partisans on each side. I think that that's a bit distracting. I think the conversation about civil war has received a lot of attention in the headlines over the last couple of weeks. My greater concern is ultimately the consolidation of a anti-democratic right-wing regime. And I think that what my article did was it just put a straightforward label on it. And Lawrence Tribe talks about despotism and other people talk about autocracy. I just said, this would be a dictatorship. And that's something that folks broadly understand. And that would be terrible for American society. It would be disastrous for the rest of the world and for Canada in particular. And we don't have any plan for this kind of thing in Canada. In fact, it's been regarded as so outlandish, sort of beyond the pale, unimaginable, that we haven't even started a conversation about it. And I think what has happened with the books, for instance, by Stephen Marsh and my article, is that dam has broken. And I think it may have broken around the world. What is the world going to do if the United States goes in this direction?
Well, indeed,
yes.
In yesterday's conversation with Barbara Walter, she, of course, served on the CIA advisory panel Political Instability Task Force. So, and that's for a number of years up until recently. So they're looking into this. The CIA is. Is the CSIS in Canada looking into it?
Undoubtedly. I'm now starting to hear from various folks within the national security and intelligence communities in Canada. I've connected with them at various points in the past through my other work, and they're starting to now knock on my door and say, let's have a conversation about this. So there are discussions going on. I have to say, though, one of the things that I found most disturbing as I was writing this piece, first of all, just a bit of background. I went back to talk to a number of experts I'd spoken to just before Donald Trump was elected, because I was writing a piece on what the implications might be. And this is at a time when Hillary Clinton was actually fairly high in the polls. But I had this sense that things would tip in Donald Trump's direction and that he had a very high probability of being elected. So I talked to a number of folks, and one of them is somebody whose name I can't use because he's a senior federal appointee, but he's an expert on American civil-military relations. And we've had several conversations over the intervening period, and I went back to talk to him as I was preparing this Globe and Mail article. And it was really striking how his assessment of the situation has changed. He was relatively sanguine about the capacity of American institutions to withstand this kind of attempt at political corruption, these efforts of political corruption, but now he's not. And we specifically talked about the military, and I have a couple of paragraphs on what he told me about the military in the United States. And he's very concerned that the military could be substantially, in a sense, suborned by Donald Trump through strategic replacements of Joint Chiefs, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and also civilians within the Department of Defense. And that, as this person said, he could ultimately bend the Department of Defense to his will. So specialists in this kind of state breakdown and civil instability always keep us an eye focused on what's happening with the military and where its political loyalties lie. If it splits in terms of its political loyalty, then you really do have a significant precondition for major civil violence and civil war, because you have two parts of the military lined up against each other. If it shifts its loyalties because it has been effectively subordinated to the autocrat, if it shifts its loyalties towards the autocrat, then it's very, very difficult for civil society, for opponents within the society more generally, to sustain opposition to the new political regime. So what happens within the military in the United States is vitally important. And I think a lot of people outside the United States don't realize, I mean, I do because I did my graduate work in the United States and studied the American military extensively, don't realize how profoundly committed the American military has been to democracy, to civilian leadership, and to the Constitution. When that starts to change, and they become loyal to an individual or a new radicalized ideology, then the United States becomes a profoundly different polity at that point.
Well, indeed, we already know that Trump installed Kash Patel, the protege of Devin Nunes, and Ezra Cohen Watnick into top posts in the Pentagon. We know about generals like General Mike Flynn, now a big QAnon adherent. These are the kind of people that Trump could put in charge of the Pentagon.
Yes.
But just in the last couple of minutes, going back to the January the 6th insurrection, of course, at its core, it was an attack on voting. And we've talked a lot about that. And we've seen the international organizations that study democracy, for example, flagging the fact that the United States has been backsliding on democracy. But the GOP itself has been radicalized, and as you quote in your article, it's become a marriage of convenience between anti-government free market plutocrats and racially anxious ethno-nationalist activists and voters. So that's, of course, describing this phenomenon known as plutocratic populism. Is there any way to neutralize plutocratic populism? Because it is so pernicious, the idea that at the end of the day, the plutocrats in this country, particularly the cynical and selfish ones, like the Koch brothers, are prospering while dividing Americans against each other, when in fact they have so much common interest. And among them, of course, is income inequality. And yet the plutocrats, you have to admit it's a brilliant move on their part to be able to steal the country blind, to be absolutely greedy and not want to pay your taxes, at the same time to turn working people against each other.
Yes. So credit where credit is due. That quotation was from Theda Skocpol, a renowned political scientist and sociologist at Harvard University. And that the article that it comes from is fairly easy to find on the web. That coalition between plutocrats, libertarian plutocrats who basically injected extreme libertarian philosophy into the Republican Party, and ethno-nationalists is at the heart of what's happened in this process. Ethno-nationalists, basically folks who are very disturbed about, who are economically insecure in many cases, and very disturbed about the rapid demographic and cultural changes of the United States. And for them, as I said before, somebody like Donald Trump, who is subsidized substantially by those plutocrats, is the wrecking ball who can tear apart the system that's not working for them. Their country is changing around them. They feel they're losing it. They feel afraid and angry. And somebody like Mr. Trump comes along and says, I can take care of you. I will fix it. And as far as they're concerned, they have nothing to lose. So this is a very powerful coalition between these elements. Of course, it's going to blow up in the end for everybody, including the plutocrats, because if the state becomes a hardline regime, it's not going to be a favorable economic and investing environment for a lot of those plutocrats either. But they're not, in many cases, known for their long-sightedness. So what can be done? I mean, the one thing that would be an enormous boon to the United States at this point would be if the Republican Party were to split, and the moderate Republicans like Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney and others set up their own centrist right party that is much more clearly committed to democratic principles and the institutions of the United States, knowing that they would lose, but knowing that in the process they could also cause these radicals to lose. What we've seen in Canada, we have somewhat equivalent movements in Canada, but we've seen that the right has essentially split. And so the radicals have coalesced within a party called the People's Party of Canada. They have a voice. They have an opening to express their anger, but at the same time they have no route to power. And unfortunately, what we seem to be seeing, and again, Jonathan Leader-Maynard has a lot to say about this, is that people aren't defecting. The moderates aren't defecting from the Republican Party. They're too scared to. And in some cases, they're actually physically scared too. They're scared for the well-being of their family. And this is something that a number of my interlocutors, when I prepared this article, were telling me, that the fear is really palpable on the part of a lot of moderate Republicans. And so they've fallen into line. And that is a process that occurs when you get these hardline security doctrines propagating through a society. But we have some time still, and it's still conceivable that there might be a splintering of the Republican Party at some point, especially after Donald Trump declares his intention to run again. So one can hope on that score.
Well, Thomas Homer-Dixon, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Thomas Homer-Dixon, who's the director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia. Between 2009 and 2014, he was the founding director of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation, and his books include The Upside of Down, Catastrophe, Creativity, and the Renewal of Civilization, The Ingenuity Gap, Can We Solve the Problems of the Future, and Environment, Scarcity and Violence. And his latest book is Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril. And he has an article at the Globe and Mail, The American Polity is Cracked and Might Collapse. Canada Must Prepare. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon. And to help us sustain this program into the future and assure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate or publictruthmedia.org, where you will find our non-profit Public Truth Media Foundation, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And if you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we'll include extended interviews searchable by topic, and have made it easy for you to sign up for daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we also encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
The guy that lived next door in 305